We're going to win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And so however dark it is, however deep the angry feelings are, and however violent explosions are, I can still sing, "We shall overcome." We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. As we were singing earlier today, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet the scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown stands God, within the shadow keeping watch above his own. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair the stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Thank God for John, who centuries ago on a lonely, obscure island called Patmos caught vision of a new Jerusalem descending out of heaven from God, who heard a voice saying, "Behold, I make all things new. Former things are passed away." On March 31st, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood before thousands in this historical pulpit of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and drawing on John's vision for a new world found in the book of Revelation, proclaimed this message of hope in the midst of persistent racism, extreme poverty, and a violent war. King preached a sermon that not only shook the walls of the cathedral at that time, but continues to provide hope to communities today. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, King said. This famous quote and several others within this sermon continue to reverberate among faith communities all over the United States. A vision where we can trust the process and believe that with each passing day, we are moving closer and closer to justice. A hope that when it's all said and done, all will be right in the world. It's no wonder we get excited when we hear visions like this. They bring a sense of newness, new energy, new possibilities, new life. And to many of us, newness sounds really good right now because our world has been turned upside down. Black men continue to be killed in the streets. Hundreds of thousands have died from coronavirus. And Donald Trump's reign of terror has revealed a very ugly truth about America. And yet here we are at the precipice of possibility. We have a new president, joined by the first Black and South Asian female president in the history of the United States. Coronavirus vaccines are beginning to be increasingly distributed, and serious anti-racist conversations about truly dealing with white supremacy in America seem to be happening. Even here at United, there's a renewed sense of vision that is energizing us all and moving us closer and closer and closer to becoming the kind of place that we know we are capable of being. This is cause for excitement. But sometimes the excitement of new visions can cause us to miss the fine print of their requirements. And this is precisely what I see when I look at these lectionary texts for this week. In Genesis 17, 1 through 7, and then 15 and 16, we hear about the vision Abraham received from God that even in their old age, he and Sarah would be exceedingly fruitful and would become the parents of nations and kings for generations to come. That's an exciting vision. Then we find Paul in Romans singing Abraham's praises as a way to convince the folks in Rome to live by faith and not by sight. Hoping against hope, Paul says of Abraham, he believed that he would become the father of many nations. According to what was said, so numerous shall your descendants be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God. But he grew strong in his faith as he gave God the glory, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Abraham is cast in these texts as an exemplar of faith who never questioned God or never doubted the vision. These texts are presented to us today in a way similar to how a salesperson would accentuate all the great things about a product without giving us time to read the fine print. And there is a world of fine print all around these verses that if we pay attention to, I believe we can find a helpful way forward that can not only bring us excitement in the midst of new vision, but more importantly can help us realize the requirements for turning the possibilities offered by these visions into a reality. So I want to talk about three things that I've noticed. And this is a plug for my students because I don't like 3-point sermons. I tried to react against that as a Baptist preacher, but sometimes you can't force the form. But there are three things that I noticed about reading the fine print of this text that can help us as we think about how can we respond to vision and how can we live into new realities. And the first thing is we must reclaim our imagination. New visions require us to reclaim our imagination because we need imagination to catch the vision, especially visions that do not already exist in the spaces where we are. Our text for today paint a picture of two people whose imaginations were caught by their own perception of impossibility. Their minds couldn't even go to that place that God was trying to show them because they had already decided what was possible. And consequently, they could not catch the vision. Evidence of this that we often hear about is how Sarah laughed when she overheard the vision being cast in chapter 18 of Genesis. What we don't often talk about is how Abraham was the first one to laugh. In verse 17 of our text for today, one of those pieces that the lectionary conveniently left out, Abraham fell to his face and laughed at the vision of God, that the vision that God was trying to help him imagine, because he and eventually Sarah too were both perpetually caught up in the reality of their current circumstances. They could not see anything else. Oh, but how easily we too allow our imaginations to be bound by the reality of right now. And I think we understand this. I'm sure we can all relate to the difficulty of seeing new worlds as real possibilities when we are confronted with the onslaught of issues that demand our energy and attention right now. People that have to navigate everyday life worried about where their next meal is going to come from or whether or not they will be pulled over by the police. Politicians who assume that there can't be a Green New Deal because that's too radical. Seminaries trying to survive amid a current of shifting cultural concerns and evolving methods of doing ministry in the world. It can be hard to see new worlds sometimes. But need I remind you that there are things we take for granted today that would have been fantasies to our ancestors of yesteryear. The fact that a young black man could earn a PhD and be teaching at a predominantly white school. The fact that we now not only have the first woman as a vice president, but a woman of African and South Asian American heritage. The fact that Georgia could flip in both the presidential election and the Senate race. Don't tell me what is not possible. If we are going to catch and carry out this vision, we have to get to a place where our default is not to draw a boundary around what is possible, simply because of what the current reality may be. But to instead recognize that reality itself is fickle and perpetually ready to be transformed. But it will only transform as far as we can imagine it to do so, because we are the ones who have to bring it to fruition. Which brings me to the second thing I noticed when I looked at the fine print of this text. Not only must we reclaim our imaginations, but we must also revise our participation. As much as we might celebrate new visions, especially when we do allow them to stretch our minds and take us in new imaginative directions, we also have to understand that new visions are disruptive. They don't fit our current way of doing things. They require something different from us. They call us out from what we have grown accustomed to into something new, which is more than an inconvenience. If a new vision is to help us move into a new reality, It is the act of creating new performances, new embodiments, new rhythms around that vision that will ultimately usher it into existence. The text for today tells us that Abraham and Sarah were both close to 100 years old when they received the vision. What it doesn't say here, but what we realize when we read the fine print, is that God actually had to deliver this vision to them 3 times before they realized that their participation had to be revised. This instance in chapter 17 was the second iteration of the vision and the promise that was given. And it took place after Sarah and Abraham had already tried to bring it to fruition by using Sarah's Egyptian slave, Hagar. Now, that's a different sermon for a different day. The first articulation of this vision initially came in chapter 15, and then the third in chapter 18, when God had to show up in a different form than the previous 2 occurrences in order to get Abraham and Sarah to finally take the vision seriously and act on the promise. Perhaps they had grown too comfortable. I mean, let's be honest, they raised a legitimate concern. I'm 100 years old and you want me to do what? Become the father of many nations? Well, that requires things that Abraham and Sarah probably had not done in quite some time. And we get accustomed to what we are used to doing. We fall into these routines that these rituals or these rhythms really that become routines that eventually become rituals that then take on a life of their own, and then they bind us when we have visions of calling ourselves out of what we currently participate in. My dad is a perfect example. He's 65. Recently retired, still got a lot of life left in him, and I can't even get this dude to try new food for breakfast. He eats the same thing every day. To say he is a creature of habit is an understatement. But I can't knock on Abraham and Sarah. None of us can. In fact, if we take away the benefit of hindsight that we have when reading this text, we can learn something about ourselves from paying attention to the humanity in it. We are wired to seek safety and stability. Think about the pandemic and how it raised questions of survival for us all. Whether personally, professionally, or politically, all of us have experienced some level of anxiety that came from wondering if we were going to make it. And it is out of that anxiety, that fight or flight survival mechanism that we all have, but none of us want to live in forever, that we seek normal. When can we get back to normal, we hear? What will the new normal be like? All of these references to normalcy that have embedded within them a human need for safety and stability, which often shows up in our tendency to settle into rhythms that we can rest in doing. But if a new vision is to help us move into a new reality, it is precisely our participation in the creation of new rhythms, new ways of being, new ways of relating to the world, new ways of speaking, new ways of moving in the world in relation to people who have less than, new ways of critiquing power structures that fail to recognize their participation or lack thereof in the work of justice. This was the main thrust of Dr. King's sermon. This sermon was not just about a beautiful vision or excitement to go along with it. This sermon was more about the fact that new visions actually require something of us. They require our participation. It was about the beauty, it was more about that than the beauty and excitement of the vision itself. In other words, King was trying to invite us to realize that the only way the arc of the moral universe will bend towards justice is if we bend it that way. Which leads to the last requirement that I see when I read the fine print of this Genesis text. Not only must we reclaim imagination, not only must we revise our participation, but we must remember to do justice. Justice is not an option. The fulfillment of this vision is contingent on us doing justice. God's hands are tied if we don't do justice. And I'm going to let that sit for a second, because God acknowledges that in this text. And if we take this text seriously, like so many people do, then what God literally says is that my hands are tied in terms of my ability to make this vision a reality. My hands are tied if y'all don't do justice. And reading the fine print of this final iteration in chapter 18 of this promise, verses 17 and following, the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? And seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. No, for I have chosen him," which is also translated as "I have known him." Almost like, I know Abraham. I know his tendencies, and I need to be very clear with him what is the right way. "For I have chosen him that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised." God has promised Abraham something that Abraham will never realize unless he keeps the way of the Lord. And how does Abraham keep the way of the Lord? By doing righteousness, which relates to Abraham's relationship with God, and justice, which is directly tied to the way Abraham is supposed to relate to the world. And the new visions that many of us are excited about right now, as we begin to see growing light at the end of the tunnel, as businesses try to survive the pandemic, as we try to resist the tragedy of racism and white supremacy, as we try to level the playing field in terms of sexism and heterosexism, all of these visions that we have for the world and what it can be will never be realized if at any point we forget that the visions unfolding will forever be contingent on our doing justice. God's hands are tied if we do not do justice. So as we stand here at the precipice of all this possibility, in the excitement of these moments, let us not forget to read the fine print. Let us reclaim the imagination that can make a new visions a possibility. Let us remember that revising our participation is essential for making new visions realities. And let us remember that none of this matters if we lose sight of the central concern of new visions: justice. Amen.